In the frozen outskirts of Denver, a storage auction hammer echoes across the wind as Ryan Walker, a 40-year-old former Navy SEAL, places a desperate $50 bid on a storage unit nobody else wants. The crowd laughs. They see broken furniture and ruined boxes. But Ryan isn't searching for treasure. He's searching for a lifeline. Inside the rusted unit, dust and decay hide a forgotten military trunk, one marked with a name Ryan has spent his whole life wondering about. And when he opens it, the yellowed letters and fading metals inside shake the ground beneath him. Some secrets aren't lost. They're waiting to be found. Before we dive into this story of fate, family, and second chances, share this video with someone who loves meaningful stories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful journeys. See, auction in the winter wind of Denver. Snow swept across the storage lot, turning the concrete yard into a field of white breath. Ryan Walker paused at the entrance, letting the cold bite into his cheeks before he stepped forward. At 40, he carried the kind of presence that came from years of discipline and damage. His face was angular, wind-cut, with dark stubble along the jaw and faint scars that looked older than the winters he had survived. His broad shoulders filled the navy blue winter coat he wore, the fabric stiff from long use rather than style. Under it lay a red and black flannel shirt and well-worn jeans, the frayed seams whispering a story of hard seasons. His left leg dragged a fraction behind the right, a limp born from a blast in a desert far from Colorado. Most people barely noticed it. Ryan felt it every hour. Not the pain, which had faded into a dull companion, but the reminder. He was no longer the man who could sprint through gunfire without thinking. Beside him moved Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat dusted with snowflakes. Ranger walked with precise, quiet steps, the kind that betrayed rigorous training and a watchful mind. His amber eyes were sharp and steady, almost solemn, but softened whenever he looked up at Ryan. The black service harness across his body read "Service Dog, Do Not Pet," though strangers often reached toward him anyway. Ranger responded by leaning closer to Ryan, protective without aggression, loyal without question. The auctioneer, a tall, thin man in a faded parka, who introduced himself earlier as Mark Henson, though he barely made eye contact with anyone, lifted the metal latch of another storage unit. Mark had a narrow face, sunken cheeks, and thinning blonde hair that stuck out in defeated wisps from under his beanie. His voice, thin from years of shouting over wind and engines, carried the sharp impatience of someone whose life had been carved down to long days and short tempers. A cluster of regular bidders had gathered around, most of them seasoned hunters of abandoned storage treasures. One woman in the group, Donna Briggs, stood out because she towered over nearly everyone. She was in her early 50s, tall, raw-boned, with a streak of silver in her black braid, and hands calloused from running a small moving company west of the city. Donna was known to be blunt, efficient, and almost impossible to outbid when she set her mind on something. Today, she barely glanced at Ryan, dismissing him as another desperate newcomer. Mark swung open the door of Unit 317, and the crowd groaned. Inside lay nothing but broken chairs, cracked cleaning buckets, a sagging dresser, and a graveyard of soggy cardboard boxes slumped against each other. The air smelled of mildew and cold wood. People snickered, muttering things like "junk pile" and "don't waste your gas money." Donna shook her head and stepped back, already moving toward the next unit. Ryan stayed where he was. He had arrived with exactly $200 left in his bank account. Rent was due in a week. His VA paperwork for disability support was still under review. Most nights he woke up soaked in sweat, heart pounding, Ranger pressing against him until the nightmare faded. When he brushed snow off his coat that morning, he had told himself he needed a small win. Even $20 earned from selling scrap could buy groceries. But the unit looked worse than worthless. It looked like a mistake he could not afford to make. Ranger, however, stood completely still. His ears lifted, his gaze fixed on the back corner where the shadows deepened into a quiet pocket of darkness. The dog's chest expanded with a slow, deliberate breath, the kind he took when he sensed something off. A scent, a shift, a memory. Ryan knew that posture. It had once saved their team. The bidding began at 200. No one raised a hand. 100. Still no movement. 75. Mark exhaled in annoyance. 50. Silence. Ryan felt something sink inside him. A tug of instinct, or desperation, or both. He glanced down. Ranger hadn't moved, but the dog's tail hovered just above the ground in a stiff, alert line. Not fear, recognition. Something in the unit mattered. Ryan's hand lifted almost on its own. 50, I'll take it. Laughter rippled through the group. A few elbows nudged each other. Donna gave him a pitying look, as if to say she hoped he wasn't gambling away his grocery money. Mark, relieved more than pleased, slammed the lock shut and handed over the key. Unit 317 is yours. By the time the crowd dispersed, the wind had thickened into icy sheets that scraped across the concrete. The storage yard felt emptier than before, the white horizon stretching out like a reminder of how small a man could feel in the wrong season of his life. Ryan stood before Unit 317 with the key pressed in his palm. Ranger sat close to his leg, leaning in gently. Ryan could almost hear all the worries pressing through his chest. The rent, the limp, the job applications with no replies, the shadows he carried from the battlefield, the loneliness he never admitted out loud. He breathed out a cloud of white. Ranger lowered his head, then rose on his front paws and let out a soft, low bark, almost like encouragement, almost like warning. Ryan stared at the rusted metal door, its chipped paint clinging to a life long gone, and felt the knot in his gut tighten. He had no idea what waited inside that cold unit or beyond it. But he knew one thing. The next step he took would change everything. The steel trunk and the winter letters. Cold air drifted from Unit 317 like the slow exhale of something long forgotten. Ryan steadied the flashlight in his hand and stepped deeper into the cluttered space. Ranger padding beside him, with the quiet certainty of a guardian who had memorized the rhythm of his master's breath. The beam of light slid over broken table legs, a cracked television from the early 90s, and stacks of dented cookware whose mismatched lids clanged softly every time Ryan moved a box. He knelt and began sorting the mess into 3 piles. One for things that might sell, one for donations, one for the scrap heap. Most items, splintered chairs, rusted metal frames, cracked ceramic bowls, fell straight into that last category. But every so often, he found something unexpectedly sturdy. A solid maple cutting board, a heavy cast iron skillet seasoned with years of use, or a set of stainless steel tools still in decent condition. They belonged to someone who had cared about the objects once, someone who had lived with intention. Ranger lay down near the doorway, chest low to the ground, ears rotating like small weather vanes. His amber gaze swept the yard outside while his tail flicked against the concrete in slow, thoughtful taps. Ryan could tell by the dog's posture that he was in work mode, watchful, alert, calm, in the way only a highly trained service dog could be. Halfway into the sorting, Ryan tugged at a large tarp buried beneath 2 collapsed cardboard boxes. The tarp resisted, then yielded with a sharp puff of dust. Beneath it sat a steel trunk painted in a faded olive green tone, the kind used in forward-deployed Navy units decades ago. The paint chipped in long scars, as if the trunk had weathered not just war zones, but time itself. On its lid, barely visible through scratches, were stenciled letters, M. Harris, U.S. Navy. Ryan froze. Harris was the middle name on his own birth certificate, the one detail his adoptive parents never explained, brushing it aside with vague smiles and phrases like, "It's just paperwork, sweetheart," when he was a child. He never pushed harder. Some answers hurt more than questions. His breath fogged the cold air as he lifted the trunk's latch. The metal clicked with a tired sound, as though relieved to be opened after years of silence. Inside lay a careful collection of a life. A series of medals, some bronze with faded ribbons, others silver and glinting even in the dim light. A handful of Navy unit patches, folded with military precision. A thick, weather-beaten journal, stained at the corners. And a bundle of letters tied by a frayed twine ribbon, the pages yellowed like autumn leaves kept long past their season. Ryan picked up the top letter. "To Michael Harris, my brother," it began. The handwriting belonged to a man who wrote with purpose. Steady strokes, hard pressure, the kind born of a disciplined hand. The return address belonged to a small Midwest town he had never heard of. He read slowly, each sentence a weight. Michael Harris had returned from war, fractured at the edges. He struggled to settle back into ordinary life. He worked odd jobs, he avoided crowds, he fought off ghosts no one else could see. And in the margin of one letter, nearly smudged away by age, Ryan found a line that made his heart pound in his ears. "You should try to find your son someday. He deserves to know you tried." The words blurred as an unexpected tremor passed through him. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift in Ryan's breathing, then rose and pressed against his leg. The dog's presence grounded him, steadying the swirl of disbelief and dread. He closed the journal and placed the letter bundle back into the trunk with careful hands. The cold outside deepened into blue dusk as the sun dipped behind the storage facility's concrete wall. Ryan gathered the few items he intended to sell: an old sturdy lamp, a small wooden cabinet, and the cast-iron cookware, and loaded them into the back of the rented pickup. Ranger leapt into the passenger seat, circling once before lying down, though he kept his head lifted, eyes fixed on the entrance gate. As Ryan tightened the straps holding the cabinet, Ranger let out a low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, a warning. Ryan followed the dog's gaze. A black SUV idled at the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine humming softly like a secret. The windows were tinted, hiding whoever sat inside. For a moment, the vehicle didn't move. Only the exhaust plume rose into the winter air. Then the driver pulled away, slow and deliberate, turning the corner and disappearing into the early evening haze. Ryan swallowed hard. He had seen enough suspicious vehicles during deployments to recognize when someone wasn't simply passing by. Whoever it was had been watching them long enough for Ranger to take notice. He shut the trunk of the pickup, slid into the driver's seat, and rested his hands on the cold steering wheel. Ranger's warm breath touched his arm, a small comfort against the rising weight in his chest. The steel trunk waited in the back of the unit, full of stories he didn't ask for, and questions he wasn't ready to answer. Ryan stared at the darkening sky. He had come to the auction hoping for a simple chance to survive another month. Instead, he had found the first thread of a mystery tied to the very blood in his veins, and he wasn't the only one following it. Shadows that follow and secrets unearthed. Wind scraped against the thin windows of Ryan's apartment, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow rising from the alley below. Inside, the warmth of a small space did little to settle the unease growing in him. He laid everything he had taken from the steel trunk across the narrow kitchen table, the metals catching faint glints from the low lamp. Each item felt heavier than its physical weight. The black and white photograph of a man in his 50s, angular jaw, straight nose, weary gaze, looked unsettlingly familiar, as though a distant reflection stared back at him through decades. Ranger positioned himself by the door, body low yet coiled, his front paws stretched long and his head resting atop them. But his eyes remained open, alert, shifting between Ryan and the faint shadows under the doorsill. He had slipped into guard mode the moment they stepped through the apartment threshold. Ryan sifted through the documents, fingers brushing old creases. A worn birth certificate, the edges flaking like paper left too close to fire, bore the name Michael Harris on the father line. The child section read only baby boy, adoption pending. The year matched his own birth year exactly. A tight pulse throbbed in his throat. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of possibility press against his chest. If this was truly connected to him, then someone, somewhere, had kept far more from him than he ever imagined. And if someone else had been watching Unit 317, maybe those secrets were not meant to surface. He opened the next letter. This one was typed by a local attorney from a small Montana town. The attorney, Gregory Falk, described a modest trust fund in a cabin located near the northern border of the state. The property and funds were to be transferred to my blood-born son, should any legitimate claim ever arise. Another envelope, never mailed, carried handwriting that trembled with regret. Michael had written of illness, of time slipping away, and of the aching knowledge that he had failed as a father long before he had the chance to try. His final line echoed in Ryan's mind. Wherever you are, I hope you grew into someone better than I ever was. Ryan's hand shook. Beneath the ache of revelation lay a harder truth. He had spent his life believing he had no living ties to anyone. Now, he wasn't sure if he was ready for the opposite. A sudden click against the window snapped Ranger upright. The dog rose in one smooth motion, muscles rigid, ears pointed sharply toward the sound. Ryan turned, heart pounding. A shadow slipped past the frosted glass, barely visible. The door handle rattled once, softly. Ranger growled, a low, guttural warning that echoed off the apartment walls. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, retreating swiftly down the external walkway. Ryan crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling aside the curtain just enough to glimpse a line of deep footprints leading toward the stairwell. Someone had been watching, someone had tried the door, someone who knew he had opened the trunk. Sleep was not an option that night. Ryan stayed awake with the lamp burning low, while Ranger lay across the doorway like a living barricade. By morning, a pale sun melted thin layers of frost off the windshield of the rented pickup. Ryan loaded a few sellable items into the bed, mostly cookware and a couple wooden pieces. He drove to a small thrift shop owned by a retired Marine named Arthur Art Delaney. Art was a stout man in his late 60s, with weathered brown skin, a short salt and pepper beard, and arms still thick from decades in uniform. His eyebrows slanted downward, giving him a permanent expression of suspicion, but everyone in the veteran community knew he had a soft spot for men who came home carrying burdens. Art lifted the medals the moment Ryan placed them on the counter. "You don't sell these lightly," he said. His voice carried a gravelly texture, worn from shouting commands in his youth and years of cigarettes afterward. "They're not for sale," Ryan replied. "I just found them." Art squinted at the name. Harris, Michael Harris, Navy man, quiet type, kept to himself. He tapped a finger on one of the ribbons. "He used to come here sometimes, never talked much, but he always paid to keep a storage unit going. Told me once it was the last thing he hadn't failed." Ryan felt his chest tighten. Art glanced up at him, expression softening. "Whatever you found, son, take care with it. Some stories are locked away for a reason." Ryan nodded, thanked him, and bought a few supplies before leaving. Night settled early over Denver. Ryan and Ranger returned to the storage facility to gather the remaining large items before the rental deadline expired. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals beneath the lonely overhead lights. When Ryan backed the truck toward Unit 317, Ranger suddenly stiffened. A black SUV idled near the main gate again. Two men stepped out this time. The first, a narrow-faced man with a sharp nose and close-cropped dark hair, pretended to smoke, though the cigarette never lit. His jacket hung loose on a lean frame, hands restless at his sides. The second man was bulkier, broader, with a shaved head and a deep scar running from the corner of his eye to his jaw. He stood with a heavy stillness that suggested he was used to intimidation and accustomed to having it work. Ranger took 3 slow steps forward, every hair along his spine rising. The dog's tail froze in a straight warning line. The bulkier man glanced at the harness, reading, "Service dog, do not pet." He muttered a curse. The lean man nudged him. "Forget it," he whispered, though the words carried across the empty yard. "Not worth the noise." Both men retreated to the SUV and drove off into the gathering snow. Ryan stood, quietly, jaw tight, heart thrumming. They hadn't come for old furniture. They had come for something inside the trunk, or to stop whoever opened it. He looked down at Ranger, who remained in a rigid stance. "Yeah," Ryan murmured. "I get it. This isn't over." And in that moment, under the flicker of the cold lights, he knew 2 things with absolute certainty. He had stumbled into a story far bigger than a forgotten storage locker, and danger had already found his name. The hunt through the blizzard, snow clouds rolled over the Montana sky like slow-moving giants, swallowing the daylight one breath at a time. Ryan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, keeping the truck steady as it cut through the long stretch of highway leading north. Ranger lay curled in the back seat, but his amber eyes never left the rear window. The dog had felt the tension even before the sky turned white. He sensed Ryan's heartbeat shifting into old warrior rhythms, measured, alert, coiled with purpose. Earlier that morning, after reading every document twice, Ryan had called the number printed on the attorney's letter. The man who answered sounded older, his voice carrying a weary calm, like someone who had spent a lifetime navigating other people's grief. The attorney introduced himself as Harold Kinsey, a 70-year-old with a soft drawl and a stern professionalism. Harold had thin white hair combed neatly back, a square jaw softened by wrinkles, and a tone that suggested he preferred honesty over comfort. When Ryan read the file number aloud, Harold fell silent for several seconds. "I never thought I'd hear that case again," he finally murmured. "Michael Harris passed last winter, heart failure. He left behind a small cabin, a modest trust, and one last request. If his son ever showed, everything was to go to him." A pause. The only thing he spoke about in the final weeks was regret and hope. Hope that you, whoever you were, would turn out better than he managed to. Ryan had no answer for that. He only thanked Harold before ending the call, staring at the blank wall of his apartment for a long time. Ranger pressed his head into Ryan's knee, nudging him toward a decision he had feared to make. By noon, he was driving north, chasing a stranger's legacy through winter roads. Hours later, the wind sharpened. Snow thickened into white curtains. Ryan slowed the truck to a crawl as the world around him dissolved into pale blur. The mountains rose like dark silhouettes in the distance. He glanced in the rear mirror. Empty highway. Then Ranger's ears twitched. A low growl built beneath the dog's breath. Ryan shifted his eyes again. A pair of headlights pierced the snow haze far behind them. Too distant to see the vehicle, but unmistakably there, approaching. The same heavy, uneasy feeling from Denver tightened in Ryan's chest. The lights drew closer. A black SUV took form through the storm, sliding up the lane with predatory steadiness. Ryan pulled into the right lane, pretending not to notice. The SUV stayed behind them for half a mile, then moved left, pacing the truck. Ranger rose onto all fours, bracing himself, the fur along his spine lifting. Without warning, the SUV lunged toward them. Ryan jerked the steering wheel, fighting to keep the truck aligned on the icy road. Tires skidded, metal rattled. A single mistake, one wrong angle, and the truck would tumble into the ravine running parallel to the mountain highway. The SUV rammed again. "Easy, Ranger," Ryan muttered, jaw clenched. "Not now." But the dog was already pressed against the seat, ready for whatever was coming. The SUV swerved a final time, then suddenly backed off. It slowed, letting the snow swallow it from sight. Ryan didn't relax. Men like those didn't give up because weather grew worse. They waited, they watched, and they followed. By dusk, the storm had thinned enough to reveal the scattered pines leading to the cabin marked on Harold's map. The road narrowed, snow rising high on either side like frozen walls. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney of a ranch house nearby, though the cabin itself looked abandoned. Dark windows, roof sagging slightly under winter weight. Then Ryan saw it. Parked beside the cabin was the black SUV. Ranger growled, sharp and deep. Two men were already at the front door, prying at the lock. One was tall and stringy, his cheeks hollow beneath a mess of dark hair, his movements twitchy. The other was heavier, with barreled shoulders and sun-leathered skin, thick fingers gripping a pry bar like he had broken into more than one home before. Their breath curled into the cold air, harsh with impatience. Inside, a faint silhouette moved. Someone small, older, her posture tense. A woman. Ryan jumped from the truck before it had fully stopped. He slipped slightly on the snow, catching his balance just as Ranger bolted to his side. "Hey!" Ryan shouted. The men spun. The tall one pulled a knife, thin and gleaming. The broad one raised the pry bar. Ranger braced himself, hackles up, a low rumble shaking through his chest. The older woman inside stepped closer to the window. She was in her early 60s, perhaps, with pale, wind-bitten skin, gray hair tied in a low knot, and a thick wool coat wrapped around her thin frame. Her face was lined with worry, but carried the resilience of someone who had weathered more winters than she cared to count. She was Martha Calloway, the widow who lived on the neighboring ranch, the woman Harold had tasked with checking on the cabin and its papers. "Stay where you are," she called, voice trembling but brave. The smaller man lunged first. Ryan sidestepped, sweeping up a fallen branch from the snow. Years of training guided his movements, sharp and instinctive. The man slashed, but Ryan blocked, twisting his wrist until the knife clattered into the snow. The second man swung the pry bar. Ranger launched forward, teeth sinking into the man's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon with a desperate yell. "Hold!" Ryan commanded. Ranger didn't attack further. He only pinned the man with a crushing grip that forced surrender. Within minutes, Martha had called the sheriff. 2 patrol trucks arrived, lights slicing through the dark like blue beacons. The intruders were cuffed and hauled away, muttering excuses about money owed and buried cash that Michael Harris supposedly held. But inside the cabin, the truth waited plain as the frost on the windows. Neatly stacked documents, a copy of the will, the trust papers, a life's worth of regret, clean, legal, and genuine. Ryan stood in the dim cabin, Ranger beside him, and felt something shift inside. The world he had known, one of loss, restlessness, and wandering, suddenly had a frontier of its own. Michael Harris had not left behind treasure. He had left behind a chance for Ryan to begin again, and perhaps, finally, to belong somewhere. A new home in the soldiers who wandered back. Sunlight settled gently over the clearing, glinting off the thin crust of snow that cloaked the forest floor around the cabin. The last of the winter storms had passed, leaving Montana wrapped in a quiet kind of brilliance, a peace so different from the restlessness that had trailed Ryan for years. The cabin was his now. The paperwork had taken weeks. DNA samples, notarized forms, legal confirmations. Attorney Harold Kinsey had called with a rare warmth in his voice when the result returned clear. Ryan Walker was, beyond any doubt, the son of Michael Harris. The small trust fund and the weathered wooden cabin just miles from the Canadian border officially passed to him. It felt strange, having something left behind for him. Strange and steadying. Ryan left his cramped Denver apartment behind without looking back. He moved into the cabin with only essentials, tools, clothes, and the steel trunk that had changed everything. Ranger, always close, adjusted faster than he did. The dog explored every inch of the cabin, nose brushing corners and old floorboards, as though mapping out a new perimeter to guard. The cabin itself needed work. The porch sagged. The kitchen window leaked wind whenever storms pushed through. The roof gutters were half crumpled under dead branches from the last winter, but fixing it became part of his healing. He installed a ramp near the steps to ease pressure on his injured knee. He reinforced the fireplace stones with his own hands. And in a small alcove near his bedroom, he set up a wooden plaque carved with rough but earnest letters. Ranger's Watch. The accompanying sleeping corner, filled with thick blankets and a repurposed sheepskin rug, became Ranger's favorite place after dusk. Whenever Ryan glanced over, the dog's soft breathing reminded him that this home was not empty. One morning, as fresh powder coated the pines, Ryan made a phone call he had been postponing for months. He reached out to Elias Boone, a former SEAL teammate who had drifted through civilian life, with the weight of trauma visible in every clipped sentence. Elias was in his late 30s, tall with storm gray eyes and a strong build, deceptively undercut by his quiet exhaustion. His hair, once shaved tight, had grown into an unruly dark mess, and his voice carried the rasp of a man who had spent too many nights awake. Elias arrived a week later, with a single duffel bag and the look of someone who had forgotten how to be welcomed. Ryan opened the cabin door wide. "Stay as long as you need." Elias nodded once, jaw tight, gratitude buried beneath pride. "Thanks, brother." Soon more came. A medic named Trevor Mills, red-bearded and broad-chested, carrying the cheerful noise of someone who hid pain beneath humor. A wiry comms specialist, Kate Rourke, with sharp brown eyes and a steady stride, despite a back injury that had never healed right. Kate, in her early 40s, had sun-browned skin and short, windswept hair, the kind of woman who spoke few words but made each one count. She took a bunk for a weekend and stayed 3 months. The cabin became a waypoint, a resting place for wandering soldiers who never asked for explanations and never needed them. Some stayed a night, some a season. Ranger welcomed each one in his own measured way, ears up, stance alert, then tail wagging once Ryan quietly said, "Friend." It was Martha Calloway who first told the nearby community about Ryan's work. One afternoon, she brought a box of homemade cranberry muffins, still warm, wrapped in a faded quilt, and explained that a local family needed help sorting through a dead relative's storage unit. The man had been a Korean War veteran. His medals were buried under decades of forgotten belongings. Ryan didn't hesitate. Word spread. He traveled around Montana, sometimes for hours through back roads, to open storage units belonging to veterans who had passed away. He sorted through dusty footlockers, bundles of sealed letters, cracked photo frames. Whenever he located something meaningful, he returned it to the family, a folded flag, a service ribbon, a portrait from 1972. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they said nothing at all. But every time Ryan placed a keepsake in someone's hands, he felt a small, steady mend inside himself, like stitching a torn seam in a place no one could see. Ranger attended every trip. He rode in the passenger seat, nose against the glass, posture attentive. His presence comforted grieving families and dissuaded anyone with bad intentions. The cabin changed, too. Ryan furnished it with pieces he restored, an old rocker, a polished coffee table, a sturdy wooden trunk that served as both memory chest and reminder. The rocker from Unit 13 sat by the wide window facing the forest. At night, Ryan would sit in it, Ranger stretched across his boots, the fire crackling behind them. He would think about Michael Harris, not as the stranger who left him behind, but as the damaged man who, in his last attempt at grace, had tried to give his son something better. Months passed. On New Year's morning, frost glittered like silver dust on the pine branches. The cabin hummed with quiet life. Elias was fixing a lantern. Trevor stirred a pot of strong coffee. Kate watched the fire with a far-off look. the gaze soldiers often wore when remembering those who could not join them. They laughed in small bursts, teased each other about gray hairs, and fell silent when old stories resurfaced. Outside on the porch, Ranger lay in his usual guard position, chest rising slowly, gaze sweeping across the white forest as though he alone held the line between danger and peace. Ryan stepped beside him, pulling his navy coat tighter. The world felt wide, but not empty. He looked toward the stretch of woods where everything had begun, with a storage unit no one else wanted. "Feels different now," he whispered. Ranger turned his head and let out a soft, contented bark. Ryan smiled, placing a hand on the dog's strong, warm neck. The fear and confusion that once gnawed at him had faded, replaced by something steadier, a home, a purpose, and a place where wandering soldiers and one loyal dog could finally belong. Some journeys begin in the most unlikely places: an abandoned storage unit, a rusted military trunk, a stack of letters nearly forgotten by time. Yet within those broken corners, life often hides the very gifts we never expected. For Ryan, it wasn't just a cabin in the snowy woods of Montana. It was the chance to rediscover his roots, to find peace, and to build a home for those carrying the same quiet wounds and stubborn hopes. If there is anything close to a miracle in this story, it is the way God rearranges the pieces we thought were lost. He does not always answer quickly. He does not always move loudly, but he leaves signs. In the loyalty of a dog who never gives up on you, in the letters of a father trying to make amends, in the brothers in arms who walk back into your life at the exact moment you need them. And maybe, in the small moments of everyday life, a kind word, a helping hand, a gentle bit of grace, God continues whispering that healing is still possible, hope is still alive, and there is always a way home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and maybe share a moment in your own life that made you believe God is still at work around us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of kindness, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, and every heart still searching for a place to rest.